Chapter 13. When Abigail was almost 18, the Kirk family returned to Sydney. They had lived in several countries, and the girl felt an immense gap in both time and space since she had last stepped into the unit on the 20th floor of Mitchell. "Quick, look out the window," squealed Kathy. "All the new buildings." But Abigail was gazing wistfully about her old home. "Peculiar," she said to her mother. "It looks both smaller and larger." "And grubbier," Kathy grumbled, looking at the marks on the walls, the many dents and scratches that were traces of unknown tenants' lives. "Well," said Wayland, "if we can't turn it into something that feels more like home, we'll sell it and find another place." "Art Deco wallpaper," mused Kathy, "fringed lampshades." "Red plush toot seats," said her husband. "I'll shoot myself." Abigail went into the bathroom. It was still the prettiest bathroom she had ever seen, but her face seemed to be at a different level in the vanity mirror. "Can I have grown?" she wondered, "as well as all the other changes?" The face that looked back was not very different from that of the 14-year-old who had so often looked into the glass and cursed that she would never be a beauty. But time had thinned the cheeks, taken off a sliver here and put on one there, given the narrow dark eyes long fair lashes that looked engaging against the tanned skin. Norway had lightened her hair too. It was now a streaky sandstone colour. A bit like Beatie's, she thought. It was clear she could recall Beattie's face better than she could remember her own of 4 years ago. It had been a curious 4 years. They had made those months or weeks or minutes in that other country recede a little, like a dream. For the first year, her memories of her life with the Bow families had seemed bitterly real. She had been torn apart with grief for Judah, a true unselfish mourning that he had not lived to be happy with Dovey, had children, grown old. It had been a long time before she made herself realize that even if he had not drowned, he would have died many years before she herself was born. "Might have been only a kid, but I did truly love him," she said, "and I wanted him to have his life, even though I could never share it." Occasionally, during those first dislocated, miserable months in Bergen, she had comforted herself by thinking that she had dreamed the whole story, or created the fantasy because she had been so upset about her parents coming together again. But she knew that was not so. And how wrong I was about Mum and Dad, too, she thought. What a silly kid to get so harrowed. And what a sillier one not to realize that adults have as much right to happiness as the young do. Her mother peeped into the bathroom. "What are you mooning about?" "Just thinking about growing older, looking different," said Abigail with a smile. "You look beautiful, I know that," said Kathy, hugging her. "You too," said Abigail. "Do you know what, Mother? I think I'll go and see if the Crowns still live next door. Remember little Natalie and hellish Vincent?" As she approached the front door of the Crown unit, she almost expected to hear the fearful sounds of domestic battle coming from beyond, but all she heard was a piano. Her heart sank a little. The Crowns had moved, after all. She pressed the bell, and after a little the music ceased and the door was opened by a tall, good-looking boy of 10 or 11. Peering at him, Abigail gasped, "You can't be Vincent." "That's me, all right," he answered pleasantly. "But who are you?" "Abigail Kirk. I used to live next door. I used to take you and Natalie to the playground, remember?" "Hey, Abigail," he grinned with genuine pleasure. "You went away overseas, didn't you? Holland or someplace?" He turned and called, "Mum, come here. You'll never guess." Justine was overjoyed to see Abigail. The unit had been redecorated and was reasonably tidy. Justine herself looked plump and contented. "But Natalie, where's she?" "Oh, she'll be here in a moment. She's out shopping with Robert. It's her 8th birthday, you know. She'll be so thrilled." "She won't even recognize me," Abigail laughed. "She was so little when I left." "I'll get back to my practice, Mum," said Vincent, and, excusing himself, he went off into the next room. The piano started again. Justine said excitedly, "He's so promising, his teacher says. Something quite out of the ordinary. Remember what a fiend he was? Well, the moment he started music lessons, it acted like magic. He just suddenly became an ordinary, decent kid. Bill and I couldn't believe it. We say prayers of gratitude every night." "Bill? Isn't your husband called Robert?" No. Robert's my younger brother. He's Nat's favourite uncle, being so young. He's only 20. Should be here soon. Now then, start from the very beginning and tell me about everything. Did you go to Oslo University? Did you have any romances with glamorous Norwegians?" "Oh, 3 or 4, Abigail smiled. "They're irresistible people. Not serious, though." "You'll die being back in this old mundane place," said Justine. "Oh, not at all. Oh, it seems a bit hot and bright after those northern countries, but I'm going to finish my degree at Sydney University. I'll soon get used to it, and everything that happened in the last 4 years will seem like a fairy tale." The doorbell rang, and Justine jumped up. An older, bigger Natalie rushed in, her arms laden with parcels. "And Robert's downstairs with all the big ones," she cried. Her gaze lighted on the visitor. For a split second she looked dumbfounded. Then, yelling, "Abigail," she dropped all her packages and hurled herself into the older girl's arms. "Oh, you've turned into a grown-up, but I'd know you anywhere. As Abigail's arms closed around the wiry, strong little body, she had an instant pang of regret for the troubled and tearful child Natalie once had been. It was almost as if she were jealous that Natalie had found a braver, surer self without her help. The child's big grey eyes were frank and lively, the mournful little face was gay. She thought, I suppose she's forgotten everything, but even as the thought entered her mind, Natalie put her lips close to Abigail's and whispered, Do you remember the furry little girl? Abigail nodded. She's always been our secret, hasn't she? Because no one else saw her, you know. A key fumbled at the front door, and Natalie shrieked, Oh, there's Robert. Where do you see the super things he's brought for my birthday? How he spoils you, monkey, scolded Justine as she went to open the door. A tall young man entered, grinning over an armful of large packages. Don't jump on me, Natty, or I'll collapse. Where's Vince? There's an unbirthday something here for him. Abigail was half hidden by the arm of a wing chair. She felt as if she were going to faint, as though the blood were draining down to her toenails. That voice, she felt again the old agony of longing, the tenderness, the unbearable sweetness of being 14 and drowning in love for someone who thought her a child. It's all going to start again, she thought in panic, but it can't. I burnt the crochet. If it does, I won't know how to manage it now that I'm older. She cringed back into the chair, trying to hide herself until she could collect her thoughts. Put all those down and come and meet one of my oldest friends, she heard Justine say. Vincent, stop that racket. Robert's got a surprise for you. Hurry up, Robert. She felt him standing there. For a moment she could not look up. She was too afraid. Justine was chattering. Abigail, you must meet my favourite brother, Robert. Robert Bow, Abigail Kirk. Abigail raised her eyes. It was the most weird thing, Justine told her long afterwards. All you did was to give him the sweetest smile I ever saw. I always thought you were a bit of a sober sides, you know, but this, I practically melted. And then Robert said what he said. Wow, it was really odd. Abby, the young man exclaimed. Then he turned scarlet and said, Oh, I'm sorry. For a moment I thought I knew you. I don't know why I said that. I don't know that people call you Abby for short at all. His eyes were deep blue, his hair was fair. He was taller than Judah. His hands were not hard and brown. But then, he's lived to be older than Judah ever did, thought Abigail, and he's never worked as hard as Judah. The children were making such a commotion over the presents that Justine rocketed away to supervise. Robert sat down on the floor beside the chair. He shook his head in bewilderment. We've never met, have we? You must think me a nut, bursting out that way. Can't think what made me do it. All the confused, half-frightened, half-rapturous feelings that had churned in Abigail's interior a few moments previously had gone. Judah had not shipped on the brothers. He had lived. The empty place in her heart filled with peaceful, benign happiness. She knew that it was settling over her face, that if she looked into a mirror she would see the ghost of a middle-aged woman, still married, still in love, rich with contentment. She almost put out her hand to stroke Robert's cheek as she had dared to do to Judah in that long-ago year. But she did not. It was not yet time. He did not know what she knew. Tell me, she said, how does your name happen to be Beau when Justine's surname is... She broke off. But of course, that's her married name. You must excuse me. I was quite young when I lived in a unit next door. Oh yes, I know, said Robert. Natalie's often mentioned you. Used to take her to the playground. What else, she wondered, had Natalie told him. I knew some other Beaux once, she said. I had a friend. He was called Judah. Robert looked dumbfounded. But that's my name too. Robert Judah Beau. Where did you know them? They must be cousins or something. I must ask Justine. No, said Abigail tranquilly. She didn't know them. We'll talk about them some other time. Let's just sit. She wasn't sure afterwards what they talked about. It was too natural and ordinary to remember. She told Robert about Norway, and he told her about the marine engineering course he was doing. I've got this feeling about the sea, you see. Yes, of course. I think my ancestors came from Shetland or somewhere, so I suppose the sea's in my genes. Orkney, said Abigail half to herself. He looked at her half puzzled, half fascinated. May I come and see you? Yes, of course, I'm right next door. They smiled at each other like old friends. As she went out, Justine whispered, Isn't he a doll? Abigail smiled. As she bent to kiss Natalie, the little girl whispered in her old way, You won't go away, will you, Abigail? Everything's going to come out all right now, isn't it? Yes, said Abigail. When she returned to her parents' unit, Kathy said, We've decided Art Deco is too frightful. Maybe Norwegian if the doors painted with garlands and bouquets and dim colours. We've started a trend, said Abigail absently. She did not feel she would be living in that unit very long, so she was not very interested in how it would look. Kathy asked her about the crowns, nodded with pleasure over the miraculous change in Vincent. He was jealous of Natalie, you know, she said. Maybe you're right, said Abigail. Kids, whoever knows what they're thinking. And who else was there with Justine that made you look the way you're looking? Asked Kathy slyly. A university student called Robert Bow, answered Abigail. And? He's dropping in Saturday afternoon. You'll like him. Kathy was about to say something teasing when Abigail added, "He's bringing the family Bible." Kathy looked bewildered. "We just want to look up a family tree," explained Abigail. At the weekend, Robert arrived. He towered even over Wayland Kirk. Abigail saw now that, aside from his height, there were small differences in Judah's in his face. The eyes and hair and features were the same, but the teeth more regular. The smallpox scar that had dimpled Judah's cheek was missing. The hair was cut altogether differently. "He's had an easier life than Judah, just as I've had an easier life than Dovey or poor little Beatie, probably. I wonder what happened to her." The Bible was a mighty volume. The green plush had hardly any pie left at all. The brass edges were black and bent. They had not been polished for many years. Justine had it at the top of the linen cupboard. It belonged to some old great-great-aunt or such. She used to be headmistress at Fort Street School. You know the old building up near the observatory that the National Trust has now? So she made it, the little stirrer, crowed Abigail. She beamed at Robert, who gaped at her. She wasn't any little stirrer. She was a perfect old Tartar. Mother remembered her quite well. She was in an old ladies' home or something. Mother was petrified with terror of her, she said. "Old Miss Bow?" Abigail laughed, marvelling. "Who would have guessed it? I guess that's how that kid's game sprang up. Terror lest Miss Beatie Bow would rise from the grave and give them all what for," she laughed. "Sorry, Robert, I must sound like a witch, but after we've looked at your family tree I'll explain a bit." Her eyes twinkled as she smiled at him. "The rest I won't tell you until we know each other lots better." "That won't be long if I've anything to say about it. Let's go into the kitchen," she said. "Those two are fighting over redecorating the unit. We've been through the red plush loose seat phase, and I don't want to be present as they pass into the birchwood and Scandinavian with lappish rugs. Besides, now we can put this monster out flat on the table." Robert opened the enormous book and turned to one of the thick-mended pages. Hand-painted violets and faded ribbons of lilac enclosed the family tree. Each name was in a little painted oval touched with gold paint. Some of it was in a fanciful Victorian hand with long looping tails. The ink bleached to a light brown. Some names were in a round childish script, and at the bottom the names of Vincent and Natalie Crown were written in Justine's favourite green biro. Abigail fell upon it eagerly. "Your great-grandfather, Judah, where's he?" "Hold on," said Robert. "I didn't have a great-grandfather, Judah. That's just a family name. My great-grandfather was Samuel, I think." "It couldn't be," protested Abigail. "That was Trooper Bow's name, their father, Beatie and Gibby and Judah's father. How on earth? Never mind now. Gibby, that was it. Gilbert. Look, here it is." His brown forefinger slid down the painted branches of the tree till it landed on Gilbert Samuel, born 1863, died 1933. "That's not possible," cried Abigail. "He wasn't supposed to live. He wasn't long for this world. What's Gibby doing hanging around until he was, well, what is it, 70, mind you?" Robert gazed at her, flabbergasted. "Then Judah must have drowned after all," she said slowly. "Where is he, Robert?" Her finger went back to the curly Victorian writing. She found Judah Bow, born 1855, died 1874. "Oh, Robert, he was on the ship after all. He died at 19. It isn't fair." Oh, Judah," she sobbed. In a moment, Robert had his arms around her. He tried to make sense of her choked mumbles, but all he could get was, "And when I saw you, I was sure he had lived, and Dovey had had a baby, and you were descended from him. How do you look exactly like him then? Beastly little Gibby. You've no idea how awful he was, always panting to join his mama amongst the angels. He even had his funeral worked out." He raised her head and sniffed angrily. "It's just him to put it all over everyone and live till 70, little sneak." "But if he hadn't lived," Robert pointed out softly, "I wouldn't have had him for a great-grandfather, and I wouldn't be here listening to you." "I loved him so much," wept Abigail. "Not horrible Gibby, but Judah, and I knew he would be drowned and tried to warn him, but I couldn't get back. Oh, Robert, he died when he was 19. He never had a real life at all." "Now then," said Robert, and there was in his voice the firmness of Judah Bow, who had been a man, with a man's work and authority, at 18. "You're going to come down and tell me all about this. How you know things about my family, I don't know. Why you're crying about someone who died more than a century ago. You know you're going to tell me sooner or later, don't you? So why not sooner?" He kissed away her tears. It seemed a very natural and accustomed thing to do. So very simply and without embarrassment, Abigail told him what had happened 4 years before. He listened seriously. "Natalie has something to do with this, hasn't she?" he pondered. "Because after all, she's a Bow, and perhaps she has the gift. And the crochet, because it came from the fingers of that great-great-great-grandmother Alice from the Orkneys, was just enough to tip you over into the last century. She was right, you know. You were the stranger of the prophecy." "But the rest of the prophecy," cried Abigail. "I mean, it was Granny Talisker herself who believed that one for death and one for barrenness meant Gibby for death, because he was so frail, and one for barrenness meant Beatie, because she always said she wouldn't get married no matter what. And instead it was Judah for death and Dovey for barrenness. The prophecy was right, but Granny had the wrong people. Dovey wasn't barren, said Robert gently. She's the one called Dorcas, I presume. Look at the family tree again. She had a child, Judith, and it died with her, the same year she and Granny died. That was the smallpox year, said Abigail. Oh, poor little Dovey, poor little baby. And Granny, she was the most wonderful woman. Isn't it strange, Robert? Even Granny thought that my importance, as the stranger I mean, was to go back that day of the fire and save Dovey for Judah, so that their children would have 2 chances of perpetuating the gift. But it was getting that little monster Gilbert out of the house as well that mattered. Yes, that was what the whole thing was about. I had to save Gibby so that he could continue the Bow family in the gift. She pored over the Bible. I suppose there were other children, daughters perhaps, and some of them had the gift too, but whoever has kept the record just hasn't bothered to put them down. I guess old Lady Beatie just didn't have time. She was a famous classic scholar and a perfect martinet as headmistress, so Justine says. The interesting thing is, said Abigail, that you believe all I say. Yes, he said. First of all because it's you telling me, and secondly because it wouldn't occur to me not to. I mean, I had this sensation the moment I met you, that you were so familiar I knew all about you, except that it had slipped my mind for a moment. I spent that whole night trying to remember what it was. I stayed awake too, confessed Abigail. But when he asked her why, she would not tell him. He turned over the page. There's lots more room for the family to go on, he said, and already painted. Funny, these flowers are wattle and Christmas spells. They must have been done after the Bows and Taliskers arrived here as immigrants. Abigail thought that perhaps Dovey had painted those flowers because entwined amongst them were sprigs of lavender, bob cotton, and a grass of Parnassus. Poor homesick Dovey, a wife for such a short while, a widow for only 2 years. You would have liked Granny Talisker, said Abigail. She sighed. You won't care for mine. She's even worse than she used to be. She was silent, thinking of that old woman, Alice Talisker, her infinite goodness and strength, and how she had said that the link between Abigail and the Taliskers and Bows was no stronger than the link between that family and Abigail. The theory she had had when wandering the rocks 4 years before, that time was a great black vortex down which everything drowned, no longer made sense to her. She saw now that it was a great river, always moving, always changing, with the same water flowing between its banks from source to sea. How on earth had ugly, tempestuous little Beatie managed to get as far as being headmistress of Fort Street High, the foremost school of its time? I'll find out how, someday, thought Abigail. Maybe I helped a little, but I'll tell Robert about that some other day. Her mother came into the kitchen. What on earth are you kids doing? Just fooling around, said Robert. He was still shy of Kathy and Wayland. Nothing much. Just playing Beatie Bow, said Abigail. She knew her mother did not understand. That didn't matter. Robert did.